So we say, what are the principles on which we're going to base the development of the course on? One, apply best practices in terms of adult learning. Provide a flexible modular approach for the reasons that, Rob, your question highlighted. Focus on practical aspects of care. Kim, Michael, you both said it's quite condensed, and I think Irma, you said so as well. So we've got to focus only on those things that are practical. So if we talk about opioid neurotoxicity, don't spend all the time on the pharmacology underlying, etc. Just get on, mention it briefly, but get on to the practical aspect, like what do you actually do? Support interprofessional collaboration and model this behavior, and we've mentioned that before already. I think, Sherry, you brought up that point. Integrate the physical, psychological, social, and spiritual domains of care. Spiritual one, I think, is one that we could still improve upon and try to figure out how we're going to do that better. Having said that, the course starts with a spiritual experience. Creating Context was designed specifically to bring to people's attention that that we should be very careful about going into to address patients' psychological issues and spiritual issues without looking inwards into ourselves. So that's the whole point of the Creating Context, is we actually start highlighting the spiritual domain, the spiritual aspect of providing care by doing a small journey inwards. It's very short, it's small, it highlights a point. It doesn't change attitudes completely, but boy, it does have an impact, and I think it has moved some people. Creating Context is often very difficult for certain learners, because you start going into sort of an emotional area, storytelling area, and many of us who've been trained in a very sort of medical model that hasn't brought in storytelling or narrative as an important part of providing care feel very uncomfortable with it. And you can look around the room, you can see, have you noticed that? Some people sort of squirming a bit, and okay, is this going to be touchy-feely? One of the most important approaches that we take within the course and explains the design is something called constructivism. Just by show of hands, who's heard of constructivism in education? A little bit? I'm sure you all have. Just the word probably doesn't ring a bell, but as soon as you hear the concept, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's basically that we as adults and adult learners come to a learning experience with our own experiences, with our own stories, with our own set of knowledge. And then together we construct new knowledge. We build upon one another's experiences. The history, the concept was first trialed in Banff as a retreat format in 2000 and 2001. And Rob, I think we will never forget that experience because we were doing it on the fly, literally. It was the first time, we weren't sure exactly what was needed. We did our needs assessments, but still, and we were working until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning before every day. Do you remember those evenings?
It was in the bar, at least.
Exactly. It was Rob, Peter Lawler, and then a group of us. And then we went into Palliative phase 1, and the focus there was on rural areas. We developed a first draft, a better version of it, and we started implementing that. We did 2 or 3 courses. As part of the Palcare EdNet project, Jackie and I did a province-wide survey of over 400 practitioners, physicians and nurses in rural areas, asking them what were their needs. And so we built that in. We also did a literature review, and about a year or 2 into the project, colleagues from Manitoba, Bonneville, published a fantastic paper in Journal of Palliative Care. They did a needs assessment of rural needs in Manitoba, so we were able to bring that into the course as well. But this is what we followed. Then we went on to developing the goals, the objectives, and the competencies, the learning strategies. Then into phase 2, we identified a whole curriculum steering committee, and you'll see there physicians, nurses, pharmacists from across Western Canada, Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC. And the course really, this steering committee said, this is what we want you guys to do with the course. And then myself and Romain Gallagher went and implemented what they told us to do. And we'd come back to them in this iterative cycle. They would review it and build, and we'd have to go back and make modifications, etc. And then this meeting that we spoke alluded to earlier on. Don't worry, I won't put you on the spot, Brenda. You don't have to make it up. But we got 40 people from across Western Canada we gave them the course and said, here's the course, and they went through and taught the course and basically came back with significant amount of feedback. Not only in terms of the design, in terms of or needs that they felt had to be addressed, but also in terms of content. For example, why are you using this medication? We use this medication. And so we had to discuss that and incorporate it in so it can reflect and be respectful of varying practices, but at the same time, bringing to the people's attention where there are gaps in evidence or where the evidence does not support certain practices. So it was an exercise in best practices and evidence. In other words, that this is not a course just about opinion. Okay, it's not a course just about one or two people writing it and then forcing it down the throat of everyone else. And so to ensure that, we developed a peer review process, an extensive peer review process that involved not only experts in the field across the provinces, but also the learners themselves in the feedback that they gave back to us through the evaluation. Then once that is all done and all the content was done, we've gone through that process, it was then forwarded, sent to a review committee that blindly reviewed this product. In other words, they could see it, but I didn't know who it was that made the comments. So that I couldn't say, oh, that's so-and-so's comments, I'm going to ignore it. You know, he's a AH.
I still don't know who reviewer number 12 is.
I have no idea, exactly. And what Michael did was he then, before forwarded to me, took out all the names and identifiers. I don't know who it was. And I then had to incorporate these comments. And if I didn't incorporate them, I had to go back and justify why I didn't. So I think it was quite a rigorous process of peer review. So the learning methods we've chosen to address these learning objectives and the goals of the course include the icebreaker. We'll show examples of that. Theory bursts, small group learning, case-based learning, large group case-based learning, and then also large group discussions. So for those of you who've done the course already, most of the modules, with the exception of the communication one, have the short theory bursts. Communication, we use large group interprofessional discussions to address that. And then obviously, as creating context demonstrates, this reflection. It has to be flexible to allow components to be used separately. We've discussed this. Must meet the needs of the individual profession, so those common competencies and the specific competencies. And now we come to the arrangement of the modules. Now some people have said, why do you go from, this is creating context. I know that not because I can read, because my vision's failing me, but because I developed it a few days ago, so I know it's there. But it's creating context. Why did you go from creating context, which is this emotional, spiritual, sort of spiritual experience, and you go into gastrointestinal symptoms the very first night. And then you do ethics in there. And the next day you go into pain management and respiratory. And then you do communication. Why don't you do all the psychosocial ones, like on the first night or the first morning, and then the symptoms separately? Any idea why we don't do that? Why do we?
It's dosing. People would just shut down totally if you shoved all those psychosocial things together. And the same for the physical modalities. Like, you can only take in so many practicalities. You need to switch gears a little bit, do something a little different, and then you can come back to it.
Exactly. So one of them is to give a bit of variety and get this point across that it's a mixture of things. You can't compartmentalize so much. And there's another very important practical point to it.
It gives you something to apply the ethical or the psychosocial stuff to if you've got some factual stuff to work with.
Right. So if you don't have it right there with you, or examples of what you can apply it, you're going to have to wait for the second day to start applying some of those ethical, exactly. But there's another very important one.
You want to prepare the environment, the mental, the paradigm for the physical. You want to make sure the framework's in place before you start building in the physical symptom control.
So you're preparing this holistic approach, right? Well, do you know what happened? When we first started the course, we actually had broken up into psycho-spiritual ones, and what happened was learners were cherry-picking what they wanted. So physicians in particular would come on the Saturday morning when we did the pain and the dyspnea, and disappear in the afternoon when we did communication, and would not come on a Sunday morning when we did, what is the other one, the psychological and suffering, even though there were a lot of medical things in there. So we threw it around so that people have to be engaged in it to learn all the different aspects. The course was designed to be able to break it up into modules. And in fact, on 3 occasions, twice in Calgary, I presented courses where we broke it up. And in Calgary, we broke them up into once a month, 2 hours, I think it was.
Thursday night at the U, was it?
Thursday night at the U, that's what we called it, exactly. Thursday night at the U, 2 hours, and staggered across, I forget if it was 4 or 6 months. You can do that, you can do it once a week. It's built specifically to do that. So therefore, if you look at the package, you'll see that there are the learning objectives are integrated into each module at the start of each module for that very purpose, so that it could be freestanding. Now, the only thing you need to be aware of is that when you're breaking it up into those modules, and you can break it up into those separate modules different times of the day or of the month, is that some of the learning objectives are addressed in specific modules. So for example, communicating, speaking to a family who are reluctant to have you speak to the patient about their diagnosis and their prognosis. But there are other learning objectives that are transversal and are longitudinal across the course. For example, integrating the physical, psychological, spiritual, social domains. So you'll see, although the modules say pain management, dyspnea, delirium, psychological distress and suffering, we did that, and it's a bit of an artificial arrangement, because in real life, as you know, you won't walk into the room and say, okay, this is just physical. And so throughout the course, with the cases, we try bring in all these different elements the whole time, as you've probably noted. And you, as facilitators, should try to do that. So if you're talking about the patient in the delirium, for example, bring up the issue, what's the social impact on the family, on the caregivers, on the nurses, on the unit? So you always bring that in. So when you break it up like that, just be aware that you may lose that. But it's not a big issue. I think the course is designed so it still retains that ability to take those longitudinal objectives and still integrate them. Okay, the theory burst. The theory burst describes the concept, bring everyone together at the same level. And it's linked to cognitive psychology. So cognitive psychologists have for many years said that when we learn, one of the ways that we learn best is if we really have a scheme. So think of it as the trunk and the branches of a tree. That's your scheme. That's your representation of that particular topic. So it could be palliative sedation. And then what you do is you then add the leaves onto it, which are the small pieces of new information, new skills, that you then add to the scheme. And so you construct the bigger tree, and you keep constructing it. So the theory burst is based on this idea that we use schemes, and secondly, that it's great to have in an interprofessional group everyone on board at the same level at least. The videos we developed are ill-structured videos so that they don't fall into a lovely little world where everything's nicely organized. Either the doctor shows impeccable behavior communicating, or the nurse demonstrates impeccable skills in communicating, or they're horrendous. It's somewhere in the middle. It's this fluffy gray zone somewhere in the middle. So the ill-structured little vignettes, and it prompted a lot of discussion. So in terms of the concepts that we try and build into the course, there's this concept of constructivism, building on our experiences and creating new knowledge. The whole concept of problem-based and case-based learning. Problem-based, I think you're all acquainted with that. You use problems to learn. It's now shifting towards, the wording now is shifting towards case-based. And the big difference between the two is problem-based learning, you arrive with a problem with no real learning objectives attached to it. It's sort of an open experience that's going to now evolve. Case-based, you're using problems, using cases, but there are predetermined learning objectives identified. The whole concept of interprofessional learning we've tried to bring in, and the motto we used was, if we learn together, we should be able to work better together. It's as simple as that. There were no major theoretical constructs supporting that concept. But importantly is that in learning together, we have to learn what our various realities are, and then start appreciating and being tolerant of one another's realities. So it's not always easy to phone up a family physician and expect to go right away because of their reality. It's not always easy when a doctor tries to find a nurse at a short notice, and the nurse is running around trying to find a patient's home. The whole concept of reflective practice, reflective learning, where we get into the habit of asking ourselves, what am I doing? Is this okay? Are there other ways of doing it? Do I need to know more in order to improve what I'm doing? I mentioned earlier the whole affective component of learning. Michael was referring to some of the limitations of some of the theories. One of the learning theories that really took hold emphasized this pattern where you have an experience, it unsettles you. In my case, for example, was that patient that I had in Manitoba who said to me, you've got to treat my pain. I'm in terrible pain for my cancer. And I felt very uncomfortable. I said to him, you can't go up with your morphine because you'll become addicted. That's what I said, because I had received no training. After that, when he left the room, I felt unsettled by this. I thought, okay, there must be something else I can do. And that's what initiated my career into palliative care, actually. But these theories highlighted a very sort of practical theory-based approach. And what's becoming very evident now is that you've got to link up emotions with the learning experience. So in reflection, in hindsight, that experience I had was a very emotional experience. It didn't feel like that at the time, but I can now go back and describe those emotions that I felt, and that's what initiated my learning. So creating context has got that emotional element that brings it out. So not only is creating context important in the sense that we are going inwards to initiate that spiritual journey in a very, very superficial, very brief manner, inwards, but highlights the point of doing that. But it also brings in that affective component to learning. It triggers to say, gee, I feel very uneasy. There is something I need to do. When we were looking for a course that we could use in Western Canada, we came across a particular course that was geared towards train the trainer. And the course in palliative care basically was that neophytes to palliative care would arrive, take this 2-3 day course, and then go out and teach it. And we weren't too keen on that particular model, because we felt that if you want to go out and be a teacher, you've got to have some foundation on which you can teach from, and some experience, not only clinically, but also in terms of facilitating the process. And so we built into the process where new facilitators would be brought in gradually, would be mentored by experienced people already. I think the ideal is being mentored in at least 2 courses before you're out there as the sort of the lead facilitator or the only person.